Middle East, a modern name for a region shaped by millennia of conflict and faith. From the Crusades to the rise and fall of the Ottoman Empire, its history is marked by sacred visions and imperial designs. And we understand its present shape by studying its layered past.
I'm here with British General Simon Mayall, author of, among other books, Soldier in the Sand, about your war memories in the Middle East. But we're going to talk about the Crusades. The Crusades were a series of military pilgrimages between the 11th century and the 13th century, and its origins and legacy has been debated ever since. So what were the main motives behind these campaigns to reconquer the Holy Land?
Well, the Holy Land had been held largely by the Roman Empire, really from the death of Christ. 300 years after that, Constantine, of course, adopted Christianity as the favoured religion, eventually the state religion of the Roman Empire. And although there was quite a lot of competition between the Persians and the Romans over the Holy Land and Jerusalem, suddenly out of nowhere, in many ways, in the early, mid-7th century, the forces of Islam and the armies of Islam exploded out of the desert and took Jerusalem and the Holy Land in 637. And for nearly 400 years, more than 450 years, the Muslims dominated Jerusalem, which of course was a city holy to the Jews for millennia, and of course holy to Christians for, at that stage, 700 years, and the Roman Empire for 300 years. And at a certain stage, the pressure on Christian Europe became very intense, and for many of these centuries, Islam was very much the dominant force. And there was pushback by the Byzantines, there was pushback in Spain by the Catholics. And at a certain stage there was an attempt to try and join Christendom, both the Orthodox Byzantine Empire back with the Catholic Western Roman Empire. And it sort of came together at the late 11th century. This is 450 years after the Muslims had taken the Holy Land in Jerusalem. And an extraordinary sort of combination of religious fervor, the social culture of Western Europe, which was very much based on a hierarchy where the aristocracy were very much, their raison d'etre was war fighting. And the papacy suddenly discovered an equation that could harness that martial ardor with religious fervor and focus it on going to fight the Muslims and retake Jerusalem. And in 1095, what we now know as the First Crusade was announced by Pope Urban II at Clermont.
Yeah, he gave this igniting speech in 1095, as you say. But some historians, they place the initiative behind the Crusades in Constantinople rather than in the West, as traditionally assumed. What do you make of that Eastern perspective?
I buy it up to a point. And the other thing, of course, other people would say is that there were quite a lot of what were military pilgrimages that had already been sanctioned by the Catholic Church into Spain to retake Spain from the Muslim invaders there, which was being successful. But the key then was that the Byzantines came to the Pope and offered the opportunity of a reconciliation between the Orthodox and the Catholic if the Pope would suggest that a lot of military knights should come east. So there was a call from the east. But a crusade is a crusade only because it's papally sanctioned. So you could have a military expedition to do all the things a crusade would do, but it's never a proper crusade unless it's sanctioned by the papacy. But that combination came together at the end of the 11th century.
And this Pope Urban II, he had his own reasons also for purposes of power in Europe, I see.
Very much so, because unlike in Islam, where to start with the sultan, as it were, the military leader, the administrative civilian leader, and the spiritual leader were joined in one caliph. I mean, that began to split between sultan and caliph. In Western Europe, of course, not only was the Pope in competition with the Patriarch of the Orthodox Church, but he was actually in competition with the Emperor. So there was a division. So the papacy had a huge vested interest in accruing to itself more power and giving itself the idea that they were the leaders of Christian Europe. So Urban II had great pretensions, and he founded at a time when the imperial power was a little bit diminished. So it was greatly to the benefit of the papacy to be the champions of these great military pilgrimages.
And there are a lot of paradoxes here. I mean, slaughter in the name of Jesus and a sort of humanitarian intervention to save Christian communities in the Middle East that ended up in plunder and rape and so on. How did the clergy and the knights justify all this?
Well, I think St. Augustine, of course, had codified the idea of just war. It was always there in Islam, jihad, the defense of the religion in support of a higher goal. And the papacy were able to use the teachings of St. Augustine to say that the defense of Christendom, which in this case was a counter-offensive, we've been on the back foot for 450 years, we now need to go on the front foot. And you're right, a huge narrative was built up around looking after pilgrims, because pilgrims still, even under Muslim domination, pilgrims still went to the east. So it did build up a sort of codified law. And interestingly, as I say, it was a way of harnessing the martial fervour and expertise of the Western aristocracy, and focusing it not on fighting each other, which the papacy was very keen to try and stop, but to send it out to do something, as it were, inverted commas, religiously sanctioned. And of course, the First Crusade was supposedly led by Adamir of Puy. The leadership was a bishop who died outside Antioch, a couple of years after the announcement. But it was a really extraordinary phenomenon of that period. And of course, a little later on, you get the first of what you might identify as a modern standing army, which are the Knights Templar and the Knights of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem, who owe their loyalty to the Pope. So there are all sorts of currents whereby the Church is trying to channel the aggression, you might want to say, of Western European society in the late 11th century and use it for a, inverted commas, good cause.
Right. And actually, only a minority made it all the way to the Holy Land. But then you had a climax in the year 1099 with the conquest of Jerusalem, which was perceived as a sort of a triumph of Christianity, at least in the West. But that was a rather gruesome affair. Can you describe the scene there?
Well, and you're right. I mean, the extraordinary thing is, nowadays, even if you or I wanted to go walk to Jerusalem or even drive to Jerusalem, people say, gosh, that's a big effort. To go off in the late 11th century, no particular maps, a dangerous world. But it was a time when death was ever present, when issues of heaven and hell, God, the devil, salvation, damnation really figured in people's minds across the world. And by the time they got to Jerusalem, this is nearly 4 years after the declaration of a crusade in 1095, it was a very, very thinned out body of knights, priests, pilgrims, civilians. And it was sheer luck that they arrived in the Holy Land at a time when Islam was very divided between Sunni and Shia, as it still is. And Jerusalem was actually being held by the Fatimid Caliphate of Cairo, which were looked on as heretics by the Sunni. But when they did break into the city on the morning of the 15th of July, 1099, it really was a massacre. There were no Christians in Jerusalem. They'd all been thrown out as a sort of fifth column. So it was Jews and Muslims. And other than the garrison, who Raymond Saint-Gilles allowed to go under safe conduct, almost all the civilian population of Jerusalem were massacred. And of course, in the Middle East, it's contrasted with Saladin's retaking of Jerusalem in 1187.
And of course, Jerusalem is the third holiest city in Islam after Mecca and Medina.
Indeed.
Do you think it's doomed forever to be the eye of the storm because of all this religious passion that has been charged into it, as we see today, during the Crusades.
I mean, Islam still has an extraordinary hold on people's imagination, without doubt, in the Christian world, obviously for Jews, but for Islam, and it has become a real sort of focus. I mean, it was neglected for many years. You know, when the Ottomans basically overthrew the Mamluks, took over the Sunni leadership of the Islamic world, Jerusalem, it existed in the mind. In Europe, of course, you know, under the Reformation, a lot of Enlightenment historians absolutely disparaged the Crusades. They didn't like them. They felt they were a product of the Protestant Church, the papacy, which they thought was corrupt. And so it is interesting, really, since the foundation of, obviously, particularly the State of Israel, that the status of Jerusalem has begun again a flashpoint. But you know, less so for Christians and Muslims as it is obviously between Jews and Islam, and certain elements of both.
Yeah, and also in Constantinople, I think you described that in your book. They were quite upset about the way Jerusalem was sacked when it was conquered.
Yeah, because actually the Greek Orthodox attitude to holy war was very different from the Catholic attitude. You know, when the Byzantines had fought a battle, they'd all go almost into mass confession to confess that they'd taken life, you know, because they were under edict, you know, thou shalt not kill. Whereas the Crusader, the Catholic orthodoxy drove the thing. So there was a huge division there. And of course, you know, you had the Fourth Crusade, which was diverted and actually sacked Constantinople in 1204. And so from a very early stage, almost the Crusades almost guaranteed you would not get a unified response from Christendom to the threat from Islam, which of course continued to grow well into the 17th century through the Ottomans. And eventually, of course, almost the whole Byzantine Empire disappears with the fall of Constantinople in 1453.
Yeah, it never really recovered after the Crusades.
It never recovered really from the sacking in 1204.
And that was during the Fourth Crusade, which is quite a confusing episode in a way. I mean, why this inter-Christian conflict and sort of a diversion from the Holy Land?
Well, I mean, you find it within Islam, where the two great monotheistic religions, the heretic is always looked on as more dangerous than the infidel. So in many ways, although the Muslims were the enemy, a lot of Catholics really despised the Orthodox Church and Vicky Verki. And in fact, at a certain stage, when Byzantium is under threat, a couple of centuries later, the cry is rather the turban of the Turk than the mitre of the Pope. That in fact the Byzantines felt they could live, or Greek Orthodox felt they could live more comfortably under the Ottomans than they could under the orthodoxy of the Catholics. And of course, in the Islamic world, you know, the competition and confrontation between Sunni and Shia, and between Turks, certainly Ottomans and Safavids, was equally strong. And then, of course, you get Western Europe split again between Catholics and Protestants. And you find the Ottomans actually reaching out to the Protestants, saying both of us hate idolaters. We've got much more in common with each other than we have with the Catholic Church. So it's very complex religious background to these wars.
Yes, and also the Jews were constant victims of persecution during the Crusades as well, not only in Jerusalem and on the way, but already from the start in what is now Germany. What was the motive behind that?
Well, I think, again, under although the Crusades start out with quite a lot of barbarism, as you say, down the Rhine. In fact, the Catholic Church often protected the Jews. But there was this narrative of the Jews had killed Christ, and it suited the Catholic Church to have this orthodoxy. In many ways, the Jews found a much easier existence both under the Byzantines, the Greek Orthodox, and certainly under the Ottomans. And later, as you recall, you could say, was the reconquest of Spain a crusade? But when the Jews, when Spain was fully recaptured in 1492, Isabella and Ferdinand evicted the Jews, and they all went to have a very, very prosperous existence under the Muslims in the Ottoman Empire. So they've always had a very, very difficult time because they never had a state. They were used, as we know, as money lenders. Quite often they were then always largely betrayed or persecuted. It suited people. So they've had a very difficult time, given that the Holy Land in Jerusalem was their focus as a religion.
And there were themes of anti-Semitism that we would recognize as such even today, 1,000 years ago.
Yes, I think it has been. It's been a very, very difficult time through history, which does account for the way the Israeli state is so determined to defend itself, because it recognizes this long history of either persecution or uncertainty, even under people who are nominally giving them protection.
And of course, in the eyes of Israel's enemies and critics, they often describe it as a crusader state, a sort of proxy for the West. What do you make of that perspective?
Well, I do. Osama bin Laden always talks about Zionists and crusaders. And if you look at the borders of the modern state of Israel, they're very, very similar to the borders of the crusader states of the 12th century. And so it's an easy one for jihadists or fundamentalists of the Al-Qaeda Islamic State proposal to say, here's another set of people who shouldn't be in our land, who've taken land back off the Muslims, and who we need to extirpate from this land again, because Outremer was looked on as an outpost of the West, and for many people in the Islamic world, the state of Israel is looked on as an outpost of the West again. So these sort of very selective historical analogies remain very powerful.
And bin Laden, he made many references, I think, to 1918 and the Sykes-Picot Agreement, when France and Britain drew the modern map of the Middle East. But that was lost on a lot of people, I think, in the US especially.
Well, funny, the interesting one, Nicholas, is when, after 9/11, George W. Bush referred to a crusade.
This war on terrorism, this crusade.
That's right. That is it. Which, of course, he was meaning a worthy cause in a good aim, which will require, which is a bit like Eisenhower referred to. His book was called Crusade in Europe, and clearly it wasn't a reference to.
Sure.
But it instantly
you think it was a well-placed metaphor at the time?
It was an appalling metaphor. It was an appalling metaphor, but it just showed a lack of understanding of both what the Crusades were and the resonance still. Because instantly, as you know, Osama bin Laden came straight back and said, as soon as George W. Bush declared the crusade, the nations of Richard the Lionheart, Louis and Barbarossa rushed to take up the cross again. So that was it. And of course, he was remembering when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and you referred to my book and the wars in the Middle East. He referred again to the infidels being called in by the House of Saud to defend Saudi Arabia and then go and liberate Kuwait. And he said, the armies of the Crusaders are back in the land of the two holy cities. So for us in the West, for a long time, certainly before 9/11, the Crusades was very much a subject of great historical interest, if you like medieval history, as I do. But in the Middle East, it still had an extraordinary resonance. And some of it focused through the issue of the State of Israel.
But for a long time, in the collective memory of Muslims and Arabs, it wasn't very prominent. It wasn't until the rise of nationalism and colonialism, I suppose, that it sort of came to the fore.
Well, largely because they won.
Exactly.
The Crusades were a failure, ultimately, when Accra fell in 1291.
Yeah.
You then had the Mamluks, of course, and then you had the Ottomans, and then you had generations, really, centuries of Islamic expansion again, albeit under the Turks rather than the Arabs.
And you have spent 40 years as a military man in Europe, the Balkans, Middle East, Central Asia as well. Did you often reflect on this long history, the Crusades, during your mission?
I did, and I found it very useful, funnily enough, for having a conversation. It was an academic interest. I had some family background of my grandparents, my parents in the Middle East. I had an enthusiasm for the Middle Ages, and I had a wonderful tutor who taught me the Crusades. But of course, certainly, as the Balkans began to come apart, and of course, when we went back into Saudi Arabia, you suddenly realized that the resonances and the growth of the jihadi narrative after the expulsion of the Soviets from Afghanistan, and the sort of language that was being used as people build mythologies based on, I would say, entitlement, inspiration, and grievance. Very selective. You could say President Putin's doing just that in Russia at the moment. You suddenly began to read them and say, whoa, we think the Crusades are just a sort of niche academic subject, which, as I say, most of the Protestant powers looked on it as part of medieval obscurantism. But funnily enough, these echoes are really important, and they are feeding a narrative of either oppression or humiliation that is inspiring people to be attracted to Al-Qaeda or to Islamic State. And that language is still being used. And it was this conflation of Zionism and Crusaders that continued to have an impact in that part of the world in a way that Western Europeans, and certainly Americans, just simply didn't understand the power of that imagery.
And we have some of these symbols in the West as well. In America, they have a defense minister, Pete Hegseth, that has a lot of tattoos with sort of Crusader themes.
It's the cross of Jerusalem.
The kingdom
cross with the
Jerusalem.
Four crosses. I know.
I think that's a sign of the times, or is it just sort of something that's good on television?
Well, I'm just interested why. I'm always quite interested why anybody has tattoos, frankly, other than Royal Navy personnel. But it is interesting how you choose them, and you're right. If you are obviously not Osama bin Laden, but Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi or whoever is leading these, you are able to point and say, right, you know, the West have an idea of a crusader. He's a man with a helmet, a big sword, a thing. But we know who the modern crusaders are, and they're people, you know, with helmets, M16 carbines, wearing a sort of American flash. Oh, and look at their Secretary of State for Defense. And so again, if you're selective about the imagery you use, and you go onto the sort of jihadi websites or those sort of ones, you find these images flashing up the whole time. And it is about crusaders, and it is about here we go again, another religious war. The sort of stuff which we're very nervous about talking about, I think, in the West, or really don't understand it. But it's still powerful among those who wish to be influenced by it.
Yeah. And during this first Gulf War that you mentioned in 1991, you were part of an armored division in this rather short ground operation,
Not the one we
which was also an unusual moment of unity between Muslim and Christian nations under this UN mandate. How do you remember that operation?
Well,
it only lasted 4 days, I think.
It only lasted 4 days. I mean, it was a bit longer as we built up, and the air campaign was going on. But I do remember, you know, we had Syrians there, we had Egyptians there, we had Saudis, we had a lot of the other Gulf states. And again, I don't think we've quite realized the power of the so-called Muslim defeat of the Soviet Union, which had really empowered the radicals. And of course, Osama bin Laden had gone to Saudi Arabia to talk to the Saudi royal family and offer the Mujahideen. And the Saudi royal family, to his horror, said, we're going to let infidels into the kingdom. But it was a very interesting time, and of course it did represent that early high water mark of Western, the beginning of a decade of hubris, where the Soviet Union had collapsed, and there was the Francis Fukuyama idea that we won all the great stories. There is no other particular model. And people like Huntington said, be very careful how you interpret what's going to happen in China or Russia, or dare I say the Middle East, including Iran, which is a different thing because it's Shia and Persian, not Arab and Sunni.
Yeah. And I think also in this recent book of yours, The House of War, you have an interesting observation about the Russians. I mean, they were really at the low point in the early 90s in terms of their power and influence. But they actually saw Putin, he saw this pretty clearly, that the second war against Iraq, the invasion in 2003, would create turmoil and inflame these passions that you described earlier. So how do you remember? You came to Iraq a few years after.
Yes, I was the deputy commander in Baghdad.
What do you think of the legacy of that effort?
I think it's been really, really malign. I think if the invasion itself, one could understand some of the rationale after 9/11, one can understand the atmosphere in which it took place. I think it demonstrated a total misunderstanding of the complexity of the region. And I think the occupation was so badly handled that all it did was inflame an awful lot of Sunni, Shia, Persian, Turkish, Arab friction and confrontation, as well as very badly damaging the reputation, credibility of the West and the self-confidence of the West, particularly when you ally it with the financial crisis of 2008. So I think Putin at that stage was right to say, I don't believe what your casus belli is over weapons of mass destruction, and I'm not entirely sure you understand what you're going to do. And take a lesson from our problems that we had in Afghanistan, that you're going to kick a hornet's nest over, and if you don't know how you're going to manage it. There are ways it could have been differently handled, a much larger force structure, a better understanding of the divisions within the Middle East. But the complexity of Iraq and that whole area that was created really with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the Sykes-Picot Agreement was something that we did not give remotely enough, take enough into account.
And you think the British did what they could in sort of explaining this to the Americans?
I think we tried it. I think our leadership, again, who are not great on history,
Tony Blair, he was more of a domestic.
Yeah, that's right. And I think people tried to explain it to Tony Blair. It's well documented. It's in my book. And he just said, yes, but Saddam is a nasty man. Yes, he was. But they didn't quite understand what demons were going to be released in that part of the world, where certain regimes had kept a lid on these sort of these festering ethnic, religious, confessional frictions and competitions that have been there for centuries. So a real failure from a position of either ignorance or arrogance, not to have factored it in.
Yeah, and you also have an interesting reference to Margaret Thatcher, whom you met in 91 after she had resigned as Prime Minister. And she agreed with you that the way this war in 91 was handled, that George Bush, the elder, actually pulled the plug a little bit too early. It could have been sort of ended in a better way.
Yes.
What do you think should have been done at that
I was there, and if you've read the book, Niklas, and I was woken up and said, we're going to basically finish the war tomorrow. And we all said, well, this is, yes, it looks good on paper, but actually what we have not done is demonstrate to the world that Saddam has been defeated. When we went back in 2003, amazingly, having thought we'd had a very decisive victory in 1991, Saddam had managed to win the narrative because he'd suppressed the Shia, suppressed the Kurds, and said the reason the coalition didn't come any further than, Kuwait was because we defeated them. And we were thinking, you cannot be serious. And I think if Margaret Thatcher had still been in power, she again, as she did at the beginning of the war, would have had a much more strategic effect on American thinking. And she said, no, we've got to think about this is Clausewitz, it's all politics by other means. What do we want out of this? And what we all thought was the war's over, the casualty levels have been very low, let's all go home quickly. And that was really a disaster in some ways for the Middle East as well as it was for ourselves.
True.
And when it came back round, interesting different narratives were playing against each other.
12 years later.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Simon Mayall. We have to end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much.